The ad for free baby clothes looked completely harmless. A pregnant woman responded, not suspecting that this invitation would turn into a fight for her life and that of her unborn child. The birth of a child is a turning point in any woman's life. The joy of the long-awaited event is often accompanied by serious hormonal and emotional changes. Most cope with these challenges, but sometimes personal tragedies push a person to irreparable acts. Dinell Lane grew up in Longmont, a city of 100,000 in Colorado. She was a good student and had dreamed of a career in medicine since childhood. When she enrolled in nursing college, her family wasn't surprised. The girl had always pursued her goals. By 2015, Dinell was 34, with extensive professional experience behind her. She had helped save dozens of lives, but she couldn't save her own child. In 2014, she had a miscarriage. For Dinell, it was the most severe trauma of her life. Her loved ones seriously feared she wouldn't cope. They watched as she withdrew into herself, as she fell silent in the middle of a conversation. The woman could sit for hours by the window, staring at a single point. No one knew what was going on inside her head. However, she did not give up. A few months later, she told her family and her partner, David Ridley, that she was pregnant again. David also dreamed of a family and was overjoyed. He supported her with all his might, especially worried that after the first loss, every experience would be twice as hard for her. Outwardly, Dinell remained calm. She smiled when she spoke of the future child. Her hands, however, remained still. Her gaze was slightly detached. But everything changed on March 17, 2015. Around 4 in the afternoon, David returned from work. The key turned in the lock, a normal sound. He was met by a disheveled Dinell. Her hair was messy, her face was scratched. There was blood on her hands. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked toward the bathroom. He followed her. In the bathroom, she pointed to an infant, a girl, bloody, motionless. Dinell called her Aurora and said she had a miscarriage. Her voice was even, too even for such a moment. They took the baby. David wrapped her in a towel and drove to a clinic on the outskirts of town. There, Dinell repeated the same story. The doctors tried to help, but it was too late. One of the doctors came out of the treatment room, pulling off his gloves. He shook his head. Death was pronounced quickly. When the medics came out to the couple with the tragic news, David couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately began to comfort Dinell, placing a hand on her shoulder. She sat motionless, staring straight ahead. The doctors were interested in something else. One of them exchanged a look with a colleague. The circumstances of the incident raised too many questions. That same day, a call came into the emergency services line. A woman, in a barely audible voice, asked for help. Her breathing was hoarse and intermittent. She said her throat had been cut. She only managed to give an address. Then silence. The operator repeated the question several times, but there was no answer. When police arrived at the scene, the front door was unlocked. They found the victim, bloody but conscious. She was lying on the basement floor. Next to her was a pool of blood, a large one. She introduced herself as Michelle Wilkins. She tried to add something, but her strength failed her. Her eyes closed. At the hospital, doctors were horrified by the extent of her injuries. Her throat was cut. The cut was deep, nearly missing an artery. On her abdomen was a huge incision, exposing her internal organs. The surgeon who first examined her froze for a moment. Then he quickly began giving orders. 27 years old, a resident of Longmont, a certified professional, She was building a career and preparing to become a mother. Her relationships with men hadn't worked out until she met Dan. They started living together and decided to have a child. They were expecting a girl. They wanted to name her Aurora. For Michelle, the pregnancy was a dream come true. She talked to her belly. She played music that she thought the baby loved. The delivery was scheduled for the end of April. Dan supported her in everything. She prepared for her daughter's arrival thoroughly, collecting clothes, setting up the nursery, buying everything necessary. Money was tight, so Michelle looked for items on websites where new parents sold baby clothes for less than store prices. She scrolled through ads in the evenings, sitting on the couch. Dan would look over her shoulder, and they would discuss each purchase. That's how she came across an ad on Craigslist. A woman was giving away her boys' things completely free. Michelle was very interested. She called immediately. While doctors fought for Michelle's life in intensive care, a doctor was speaking with Dinelle. The conversation took place in the hallway. Dinelle stood with her arms crossed over her chest. She answered briefly, in monosyllables. The first thing that stood out was the lack of any medical records of a pregnancy. Dinelle claimed she had been seeing doctors regularly. She named clinics, appointment dates. The doctor nodded, taking notes. But a check revealed she was lying. Not a single record existed. Simultaneously, detectives were examining the house where Michelle's call came from. It turned out that it did not belong to her. In fact, she lived on the other side of town and had no connection to the place. The neighbors hadn't heard anything. The house stood in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by trees. The address was checked against a database. For the past few years, Dinelle Lane and David Ridley had lived there. Next, a call came from the clinic. The doctor had serious suspicions that Dinelle could not be the deceased Aurora's mother. He called the detective on duty, speaking quietly but insistently. Detectives found her at the hospital. She was sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway. David was beside her, holding her hand. One disturbing detail was immediately apparent. Despite the loss of her child, she was cold and completely calm. She wasn't crying, she wasn't trembling. She stared at the floor. Dinelle repeated the story about the miscarriage. Her voice was even, without emotion. The detectives exchanged glances. When offered a medical examination to ensure her own health was not at risk, she refused, adamantly. Her hands clenched into fists. Then they asked her directly, did she know Michelle Wilkins, whose baby had been stolen from her womb? A pause. Too long. It was obvious the question had caught her off guard. Her eyes darted around. Her answers became confused and evasive. The story began to be embellished with non-existent details. She started speaking faster, gesticulating. One of the detectives asked point-blank, had she tried to kill Michelle? Another pause. Dinelle swallowed. After that, she changed her story. She claimed that Michelle had come to her house for the ad and attacked her with a knife, just like that, for no reason. Dinelle had defended herself and cut her attacker. As a medical professional, she knew the baby still had a chance, so she and her husband rushed the baby to the hospital, but they didn't make it in time. She said this while looking the detectives in the eye, confidently, too confidently. Dinelle was released pending investigation. Despite the suspicions, it was impossible to press charges immediately. They needed to sort things out. She stood up, grabbed her bag. She walked out of the hospital without looking back. David walked beside her, bewildered. A day passed, a long, agonizing day. Michelle's condition was stabilized, and she regained consciousness. At first, she opened her eyes, but couldn't focus her gaze. Then she gradually began to understand where she was. She was able to speak with the police. The first thing that shook her to her core was the death of Aurora. When they told her, she covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders trembled. She couldn't believe that her long-awaited pregnancy had ended so brutally. A nurse brought her a glass of water. Michelle didn't touch it. Her version differed drastically from Dinell's story. Michelle found the ad and called to pick up the items for her daughter. When she contacted Dinell Lane, she was pleasantly surprised by her friendliness. Her voice inspired trust, warm, soft. Dinell invited her to her home, gave her the address. She said, "Come over, I'll be happy to see you." On the doorstep, she was just as friendly and inviting. She smiled broadly. Michelle immediately felt a liking for the woman. They even hugged upon meeting. They went down to the basement where the baby things were stored. The boxes were in a corner, neatly stacked. For about an hour, they chatted casually about motherhood, sorting through clothes and toys. Michelle looked at the tiny socks, the onesies. Dinell seemed like a kind person. She talked about her own happy pregnancy, touching and stroking her belly as she did. She mentioned that her son had grown and gone to kindergarten, which was why she decided to give everything away for free. Michelle listened, nodding and smiling. Each time Michelle prepared to leave, and she glanced at her phone several times to check the time, Dinell would stop her with conversation. She would say, "Wait, there's something else." She would pull out more items and gladly hand them over. Michelle didn't want to seem rude. After about an hour, Michelle said she had to go. She still had a lot to do. The homeowner readily agreed to see her out. She stood up, brushed off her jeans. They both started up the stairs. Michelle went first, carrying a bag of clothes. Almost at the top, she felt a sharp blow to the back of her head. Sudden, stunning. In her peripheral vision, she saw shards of a lamp shower onto the floor. A crash. She stayed on her feet, instinctively grabbing the railing. But something squeezed her neck, tightly. She tried to breathe, but couldn't. She couldn't fight back effectively. She soon fell. Her knees hit the steps. Pain. The grip loosened for a moment. Michelle came to her senses and began to fight back, still not understanding Dinell's true intentions. What was happening? Why? She tried to calm her attacker, saying, "Wait, stop, what happened?" But to no avail. Dinell was silent, only breathing heavily. The only thing that mattered to Michelle was protecting herself and her baby. Michelle began to resist with renewed force. She screamed, trying to get out of the basement to escape. Her fingers scratched at the floor, searching for something to grip. Dinell grew tired. For a moment, she let go. Michelle used the pause to try to calm her down. She said, gasping for breath, "Stop, I'll call the police. We'll sort this out." She said she would call the police. That's when the homeowner lunged at her with new fury. Her face contorted. She dragged her back downstairs. Michelle fought, but was pulled by her legs and pushed her into a bathroom. Michelle's back hit the sink, a metallic taste in her mouth. But she broke free from there, too. Dinell attacked from behind and dragged her into a bedroom. Michelle saw a bed. She saw Dinell grab something from the nightstand. She pulled out her phone, about to call the police. Her fingers trembled, refusing to obey. She was punched in the face several times. Once, twice, a third time. Blood gushed from her nose. The phone fell, its screen cracking. Dinell shoved her victim onto the bed and jumped on top of her. The weight pinned her down. She grabbed a pillow and tried to suffocate her. Michelle writhed, shaking her head. Fortunately, she managed to knock the pillow away. Her hands found its edge and yanked. The pillow flew to the side. Dinelle did not back down. No words, only breathing, hoarse and rapid. She punched her again, trying to strangle her with her bare hands. Her fingers dug into her throat. Michelle tried to appeal to her pity. She asked, choking, "Why? Why are you doing this?" She begged her to stop. "Please, stop. I'm begging you." She truly didn't understand the motive. They had been talking calmly and friendly for over an hour. They had laughed, discussed children. Michelle hadn't been rude to her, hadn't insulted her. She had done nothing. The thought of a mental disorder flashed through her mind. The woman had gone insane. Apparently, the attacker despaired of overpowering her with bare hands. Michelle jumped up, disappearing from view. A knife appeared. The blade glinted. Michelle froze. By this point, she was covered in blood from the blows and the lamp shards. Her face was burning. Dinelle inflicted several wounds to her neck. A cold blade. The pain, searing, unbearable. She cut her throat. Michelle felt something warm flowing down her neck. Dinelle continued to choke her, pressing a palm over her mouth and nose. Michelle lost consciousness. Darkness enveloped her. When she came to, she could barely contain the horrific pain. Her abdomen was cut open. She looked down. She saw blood. A lot of blood. She saw what she should not have seen. Listening, she realized the house was quiet. No sounds, no footsteps. Gathering her strength, she didn't know where it came from. She called 911. Her fingers slipped on the screen, leaving red streaks. The dispatcher told her to take a towel and apply pressure to the wound. The voice was calm, professional. Michelle fumbled for a towel and pressed it to her abdomen. The pain was blinding. Only in the hospital did Michelle realize her baby had been stolen. Dan sat by her bed, holding her hand. He was silent. Tears streamed down his face. Detectives examined the crime scene. They arrived with forensic specialists. Several rooms were covered in blood. Stains on the walls, the floor, the furniture, especially the bedroom and bathroom. The bedding was soaked through. The signs of a struggle were obvious. An overturned chair, a broken lamp, scratches on the doorframe. But there was no forced entry. The door had been open. When it became clear that the victim had been pregnant and the fetus had been cut from her, everyone was in shock, including the medics. One of the forensic specialists, a man with 20 years of experience, went outside for some air. In their entire careers, they had never encountered anything like it. The woman had suffered horrific injuries. It looked as if someone had tried to gut Michelle. Someone had worked with a knife, not knowing anatomy, not understanding what they were doing. She herself described her condition as feeling like her organs had fallen out. In essence, they had. The doctors didn't understand how she had survived. Thanks to the victim's testimony, the investigation began. They examined social media pages, data storage devices, and the attacker's phone. Investigators requested a warrant and gained access to her accounts. The detectives had to figure out who Dinelle Lane was, and to do that, they had to delve into the depths of her lies. Deep, multi-layered lies. For more than a year before the tragedy, she had been maintaining the image of being pregnant. She posted photos, wrote posts, but in reality, she could not have children. After her miscarriage, her fallopian tubes were tied, a medical necessity. She found herself in a situation where she risked losing the ability to ever be a mother. This knowledge ate away at her from the inside. Dinelle took the loss of her baby very hard. Friends said she changed after that loss. She became quieter, more withdrawn. Combined with hormonal surges and depression, this led her to a frightening idea: to kidnap someone else's child. The thought didn't come at once, first as a fantasy, then as a plan. She began spreading the lie about her pregnancy while simultaneously searching for a victim. She scrolled through women's profiles on social media, monitored ads. There were complications with the baby's age, so she initially planned to find a woman in her early stages of pregnancy, befriend her, and strike when it was time for the birth. However, she failed to befriend anyone. People sensed something was wrong. On her social media, they found numerous posts about how eagerly she was awaiting the arrival of her baby. Photos of baby clothes, pictures of her supposedly growing belly. In reality, pillows placed under her clothes. She even published fake ultrasound images found on the internet. This allowed her to convince everyone around her that the couple would soon have a new addition. David Ridley believed her and considered himself the biological father. He was happy. Dinell said she would name a boy James and a girl Aurora. This horrifying coincidence struck everyone working on the case more than once. One name, 2 girls, 1 dead. Although David lived with Dinell constantly, even he didn't see through the deception. She was careful, methodical. Dinell kept him at a distance, convincing him that he might accidentally harm the unborn child. She would say, "Please don't touch, the doctors warned me." David believed her and was cautious. He never touched her belly. Even in his sleep, he tried not to touch it. Dinell masterfully faked all the details: the gradual growth of her belly, the typical signs of pregnancy. She complained of morning sickness, of back pain. She would ask David to bring her water in the middle of the night. Dozens of photos appeared on her accounts, just like any expectant mother. Pictures from different angles, in different clothes. On her pages, she wrote about doctor's visits and her baby. In the comments, friends wrote congratulations and posted hearts. She took days off from work several times to supposedly visit the clinic. She would return with papers that she had printed herself. In early 2015, the number of posts increased. Dinell was constantly photographing baby clothes and talking about how much she was looking forward to the baby's arrival. Her followers rejoiced with her. Since there was no pregnancy, she had to keep changing the due date. First, she said February, then March, then April. The pregnancy was dragging on for too long, and it couldn't go on forever. For a long time, she couldn't find a victim. A suitable, vulnerable, trusting one. Because of the prolonged pregnancy, her loved ones began to have doubts. David would ask, "When is it happening? Maybe they got the dates wrong?" Dinell tried to convince everyone that there had been a miscalculation, that the doctors were confused, but the doubts grew. More questions, less time. There were no injuries from beatings or a knife on the body of the deceased Aurora. She was examined carefully, under a magnifying glass. She simply did not survive the improvised cesarean section due to her age. She was only 7 months along. Her lungs hadn't developed. It was too soon. DNA samples from the baby and Michelle were compared. They were sent to the lab, and they waited for the results. They were identical. The kinship was confirmed. Mother and daughter. With Dinell, there was not the slightest match. 0%. Initially, it was thought that the main suspect's partner was also involved in the attack. The detectives discussed this theory. It seemed impossible that a man wouldn't see through the lie and be unaware of her plans. They lived together, slept in the same bed. When David was brought in for questioning, he was extremely agitated. His hands were shaking. He insisted he was not involved and was himself in shock over what had happened. His voice cracked. In their years together, he had never suspected his beloved was planning something like this, or was even capable of a knife attack. He loved her. He trusted her. Dinell's supposed due date was constantly shifting, and she refused to go to the doctor with him. This raised his reasonable suspicions. He insisted, "Let's go together. I want to hear the heartbeat." She always found excuses. It turned out she had been pretending to be pregnant for 14 months. It was absurd. It's possible she attacked Michelle because of an ultimatum from her boyfriend, who had become skeptical of her pathological lying. They had argued the day before. David had said, "If you don't go to the doctor this week, I'm leaving." She was likely afraid he would leave her and therefore resolved to commit the crime. A desperate act, a last chance. David said that March 17th was an ordinary day. There was no foreshadowing. He knew a woman was coming to his wife's to pick up some unneeded baby clothes left over from a boy. Dinell had mentioned it at breakfast. He nodded, paying it no mind. He returned from work around 4 in the afternoon, as usual. He parked his car. He found a disheveled Dinell who silently showed him a newborn girl in the bathroom. She was lying in the sink, wrapped in a towel. She said she had a miscarriage. David froze. He couldn't move. Aurora's body was covered in blood. Her boyfriend had no idea that it actually belonged to Michelle, who had been cut up in their house. All this time, she lay in the basement, covered in blood, slowly bleeding out. Apparently, Dinell was sure she was dead and planned to dispose of the body later. Maybe bury it in the woods, maybe burn it. Fortunately, she underestimated her victim's resilience. Michelle survived. Her body fought back. Her heart kept beating. David immediately took the baby, gently, like a fragile thing, and they drove to the clinic together. The house showed clear signs of a long, brutal struggle, a huge amount of blood, but it all belonged to Michelle, on the floor, on the walls, on the furniture. Dinell's story immediately seemed implausible. She herself had no serious injuries, only scratches and bruises, superficial ones. Naturally, this did not look like an attack by a pregnant woman. The detectives realized this right away. Putting the facts together, the detectives concluded this was not an impulsive act of aggression. There was no spontaneity. Rather, it was the culmination of a calculated lie that Dinell had created and maintained for months. She had been heading toward this. The Craigslist ad for free baby clothes was posted intentionally, a trap. Dinell wanted to find a suitable woman who was close to giving birth. Pregnant, trusting, alone. Checks showed she did not know her victim, had not stalked her beforehand. Michelle was random. It didn't matter to her whose baby she took. Anyone would have done. Dinell might have succeeded if her victim hadn't put up such a fierce fight and survived. If she hadn't called. If they hadn't arrived in time. Furthermore, according to experts, baby Aurora would have had a much higher chance if not for her mother's 7-month term. 8 months, and everything could have been different. The fact that both women involved in the case wanted to name the girl the same name was nothing more than a tragic coincidence, a cruel irony of fate. Michelle Wilkins recovered from her injuries, slowly, painfully. She spent 5 days in intensive care, where every breath was a struggle. Then she remained in the clinic for a long time for rehabilitation, learning to walk and move again. All this time, her fiancé supported her. Dan never left her bedside, sleeping in a chair next to her. For a year, the woman who had lost her child not only recovered physically, but also prepared to testify in court against the murderer. A psychologist worked with her twice a week. She wrote down her thoughts in a notebook, preparing for questions. Dinell remained in jail during this time, awaiting her hearings, a single cell. Psychiatrists spoke with her repeatedly, including an independent expert hired by her lawyer. She answered calmly, maintaining a confident demeanor. The former believed the woman was sane and fit to stand trial. She was fully aware of her actions. She understood the difference between right and wrong. The independent expert did not share this opinion. Like the defense attorney, he was convinced that Dinell suffered from a severe form of depressive disorder related to the loss of her child. The diagnosis: post-traumatic stress disorder. After her confession, Dinell refused to cooperate with the investigation. She demanded a lawyer and fell silent. However, by that stage, the evidence against her was more than sufficient, including irrefutable proof: DNA, fingerprints, call records. But it took time to assemble all the information into a coherent case for the prosecution. The prosecutors worked late into the night. The main problem was Michelle Wilkins's condition. The doctors considered it a miracle that she had survived the brutal attack. The chances were minimal. The physical consequences of her injuries were healing. The stitches were mending. But psychologically, the woman faced a long road to rehabilitation. There were fears she might take her own life, or simply not find the strength to face the accused and testify in court. She needed time, but Michelle was very brave and resilient, stronger than anyone expected. She later admitted that she had to immerse herself in endless work on herself and in communication with other people, support groups, therapy, conversations. This helped occupy her mind and distract her from dark thoughts. However, every time she was alone with her feelings, she saw her little girl before her eyes. How Aurora is growing up, taking her first steps, going to school, to college, starting a family, her graduation, her wedding, grandchildren. Everything she was now not destined to experience. Michelle decided to move forward and believed that helping other women who had faced similar incidents or the loss of children, as had happened to Dinell herself, could help. She held no malice. She tried to understand. Michelle repeatedly told her story at meetings, in interviews, sharing the experience of how she desperately tried to protect her unborn child, even when her attacker pulled out a knife. Her voice trembled, but she continued. She maintained her composure and even tried to appease the perpetrator when she realized the situation was out of control. Michelle uttered the phrase that she liked Dinell, that they had gotten along so well and could resolve the situation peacefully. She was trying to calm her down. The words came with her last ounce of strength. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Dinell wasn't listening. But when this was said from the witness stand during the hearings, it seemed very powerful. It even brought some jurors to tears. The people in the courtroom were frozen. When Michelle came to court in 2016 and saw the accused who had taken her child and nearly her life for no reason, she continued to conduct herself as a very strong woman. She entered the courtroom with her back straight. She said she felt more pity than hatred for Dinell. It sounded sincere. The victim's relatives, on the other hand, felt no such sentiments. Michelle's mother clenched her fists when she looked at Dinell. They hated her, actively spoke out against her, and demanded justice. The maximum sentence: life in prison. The killer herself showed no remorse. No shred of pity for Michelle and her deceased child. Everyone present noted this. Journalists wrote about it. The only time the defendant cried was when the story of her own tragedy, related to the loss of her son, was recounted. Then the tears were real. The defense attorney cited his client's emotional problems, repeating this over and over. He also pointed to the opinion of the independent expert, who was one of the few witnesses for the defense. There were only 3 in total. However, the prosecution denied this, relying on the evaluations conducted in prison before the hearings began. The documents lay on the table in a thick folder. They showed that the woman was aware of what was happening and could stand trial, sane. When 34-year-old Dinell was first arrested and interrogated, she denied her guilt. She looked them in the eye, speaking confidently. But under the pressure of irrefutable evidence, the detectives laid out the photos one by one. She quickly broke and confessed to everything. She lowered her head. She cried. Now, however, she decided to continue spinning the web of lies on which her defense attorney relied. She changed her testimony. The woman stuck to the self-defense story, claiming Michelle had been the aggressor. The lawyer argued that the victim had attacked her with a knife, without reason, suddenly. Therefore, Dinell was forced to defend herself. In the course of self-defense, she had wounded Michelle's abdomen and cut the baby from her womb to save it, because she was certain Michelle was dead. There was no pulse, no breathing. The prosecution refuted this version. The injuries, sustained only by the victim of the setup, convincingly proved this. Medical experts gave their conclusions, showed diagrams. Naturally, the version looked unconvincing given the proven facts. Dinell's testimony was recorded on video and played during the hearings. The screen turned on. The courtroom fell silent. At that moment, she covered her face with her hands as if crying. Her shoulders trembled. But people sitting nearby saw no tears. Her face was dry. It all looked unbelievable, staged. The prosecution and the Wilkins family believed it was done intentionally, to curry favor with the jury, to evoke pity. Theater. The defendant was simply continuing to maintain the image of a martyr, and now wanted to portray herself as a victim, an unfortunate, sick woman. Dinell herself never testified in her own defense. She refused to speak before the jury. Her lawyer advised her to remain silent. She nodded. He tried to argue that his client's actions were unintentional and impulsive, an act of passion, a moment of insanity. During the sentencing, Michelle Wilkins, holding a large photograph of her late daughter, an ultrasound picture, black and white, blurry, addressed Dinell Lane directly. She stood up, turned to her. She was calm and composed, expressing her belief that the woman needed treatment, help, not just punishment. After everything she had been through, Michelle noted that she could never fully forgive her, but she would pray for the peace of her soul. Her voice did not tremble. What struck the woman most was the defendant's lack of remorse. She never showed it once during the hearings. Not a word, not a glance, not a gesture. Not only the Wilkins family spoke, but also Dinell's family. Specifically, the defendant's mother and sister described her as a loving daughter and a compassionate person. They recalled her childhood, her school years. They told how she had helped others for many years, working as a nurse, saving lives. They believed her act was linked to the loss of her son and the subsequent depressive disorder. Everyone was shocked by Dinell's actions and stated that it was out of character for her. Her mother cried. What happened was blamed on mental health problems and the consequences of her trauma, an illness. The prosecutor even showed those present the blood-stained pillow, mattress, and bed linens from the crime scene. He brought them into the courtroom, unfolded them, the smell, the stains, to vividly demonstrate the full horror of what had happened. Some people turned away. There was one other time Dinell shed a tear. It happened when the jury found her guilty. The verdict was read. She flinched, biting her lip. Naturally, she felt no pity for the child or for Michelle. She was only concerned with her own problems and the fact that she had lost her freedom, her life. Initially, The prosecution planned to seek 126 years in prison for Dynel. She faced a long list of charges, including attempted murder, assault, and other counts. The documents were several pages long. Before the sentencing hearings, the district attorney's office reevaluated each count. They conferred, discussed. In the end, the total sentence was reduced to 110 years. The maximum sentence for attempted murder was 48 years. For the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, Dynel could receive 32 years, and for assault, another 30. The numbers, huge numbers. Unfortunately, she was not charged with the murder of the unborn child. Colorado state law does not recognize a fetus as a person unless it has lived for at least 1 day outside the womb. A legal technicality, a cruel one. In essence, no matter what, Dynel was facing a lifetime behind bars. She understood that. So did her lawyer. After hearing the arguments from both sides, the closing arguments lasted 3 days. The jury retired to deliberate. The wait was long, but they returned quickly with a unanimous decision, all 12 of them. 35-year-old Dynel Lane was found guilty on all counts and was later sentenced to 100 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge read the sentence in an even voice. The Wilkins family was very pleased with the decision, as were all concerned citizens who wanted to keep the streets of their hometown safe. They hugged, crying with relief. They believed that Dynel did not deserve a place in society, and in prison she would have enough time to re-evaluate her actions, to understand, to repent. Despite this victory, Michelle Wilkins's path to healing was just beginning. Physically, she had overcome most of the consequences by the time of the trial. The scars remained, but they had healed. Mentally, she was still trying to cope with the ordeal. She couldn't sleep at night. She had nightmares. Later, Michelle spoke with journalists many times, giving interviews. She said she found solace in her work, helping women who had lost children. But even so, she still recalled her daughter's lifeless body with tears in her eyes. So small, so cold. Dynel's defense claimed that the woman had been treated with prejudice. They filed one appeal after another. They insisted that she needed to undergo a more thorough psychiatric evaluation and be provided with treatment instead of imprisonment. A hospital, not a prison. However, considering how meticulously the trap had been prepared, the ad, the lie, the plan, and how cold-bloodedly the attack was carried out, the prosecution was convinced that there could be no leniency. Justice must be served. All appeals from the defense were denied, one after another. The defense attorney remained convinced that she had a high potential for rehabilitation and that the sentence handed down was too harsh. Inhumane. In an interview after the trial, the district attorney stood before the cameras and stated that such a sentence was appropriate for the brutal nature of the crime, commensurate with its severity. Before this incident, the county had never recorded a case where a pregnant woman was intentionally attacked for the purpose of stealing her unborn child. The first time in its entire history. Dynel is still behind bars, a cell in the Colorado women's prison. The Wilkins family hopes it stays that way forever, for the rest of her days.